Hi everybody, this video is going to show solid proof that one generation in Matthew 24 is really equal to 67 years and 79 days. In my opinion, this is huge, so I hope you'll bear with me as we go through here and show that Scripture itself in the Bible does say that one generation is 67 years and 79 days. So many Bible scholars believe the budding of the fig tree in Matthew 24:32 refers to the creation of the country of Israel in 1948. We all know that. Jesus said once that fig tree buds, all the things on his timeline will be fulfilled within one generation. And he said in Matthew 24 verse 34, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Okay. So the exact length of a generation is explained in Matthew chapter 1, verse 17. It says, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. So if we can find the exact number of years from Abraham to David and divide that by 14, that will give us the exact number of years in one generation. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to start with Abraham and we're going to calculate the years to David in the Bible. So Genesis 12:4 says Abraham was 75 years old when he left to go to Canaan. So from Abraham's birth to the start of his trip to the Promised Land, there were 75 years. Then Genesis 21 verse 5 says Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So there were 25 years between the time Abraham left to Canaan until his son Isaac was born. Then Genesis 25 verse 26 says Jacob was born when Isaac was 80 years old. Well, the word score is an old word for the number 20. So 1 is 20 and 80 is 60. So this is saying Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born. So there were 60 years from Isaac's birth until his son Jacob was born. Then Genesis 47 verse 9 says Jacob was 130 years old when he entered Egypt. So there were 130 years from Jacob's birth until he and his sons entered Egypt. Okay, so here's where the timeline becomes slightly more complicated. The next significant event on the timeline to David was the Exodus from Egypt when the children of Israel escaped. And we're told in Exodus 7 verse 7 that Moses was 80 years old at that time. In other words, 80 years old when he spoke to Pharaoh at the time of the Exodus. So 80 years before the Exodus, Moses was born. But that leaves a gap in the timeline. And in order to fill the gap, we need to examine the events surrounding Jacob's entry into Egypt. So in Genesis 45, verses 4 through 6, Joseph is talking to his brothers after his father Jacob and his brothers arrived in Egypt. And he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. God did send me before you. For these 2 years has the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in which there shall be neither earing nor harvest. So this tells us that there were a total of 7 years of famine, and Joseph's brothers arrived in the second year of that 7-year famine. So the famine that Joseph is referring to is the 7 years of famine. And he said Jacob and his sons arrived in Egypt in the second year of that famine. In Genesis 41, 29 and 30, we're told there are 7 years of plenty that come right before the 7 years of famine. And in Genesis 41, 46 through 48, we're told Joseph arrived in Egypt at the start of the 7 years of plenty when he was 30 years old. This means Jacob and his sons arrived in Egypt 9 years after Joseph arrived. So Joseph was 39 years old when Jacob arrived in Egypt. Then Genesis 50 verse 26 tells us Joseph died when he was 110 years old. So Joseph's death at 110 was 71 years after Jacob arrived in Egypt. So I'll just calculate this here in case you don't have a calculator handy. So we know that Joseph was 110 when he died, and we know he was 39 when Jacob arrived in Egypt, so we'll subtract 39 from that, and that leaves 71 years. So 71 years after Jacob arrived in Egypt until Joseph died. And next we need to find the number of years between Joseph's death and Moses' birth. So Exodus 12:40 and 41 tells us the Exodus occurred after 430 years. It says the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So that tells us that there was a 430-year period that ended on the same day that Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt. So some have interpreted Exodus 12:40 and 41 to mean that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. However, we're going to find out right now that the texts make it clear that that is not possible. So the first clue is that Moses was 80 years old when the Israelites left Egypt. And the second clue is that Exodus 6 tells us Moses was a descendant of Levi. And Genesis 35 says Levi was one of the sons of Jacob. So Exodus 6 gives us the lineage from Levi to Moses. It said Levi had a son named Kohath, who had a son named Amram, whose son was Moses. And Genesis 46 gives us the names of Jacob's children and grandchildren who entered Egypt with him. And Kohath's name is listed as Levi's son. That means Kohath was already born when Jacob entered Egypt. So Exodus 6 tells us Kohath lived for a total of 133 years, and his son Amram lived for a total of 137 years. So even if Kohath was born on the exact year that Jacob entered Egypt, and even if Kohath's son Amram was born in the last year of Kohath's life, and even if Moses was born in the last year of Amram's life, that would only leave a total of 350 years in Egypt. So we'll calculate 133 years for Kohath's life. That would just be the maximum. If Kohath was, we know Kohath was born when they entered Egypt, but if he was literally born that same year, then we could use all 133 years of his life. And if his son Amram was born in the last year of his life, then we could add 137 years total for Amram. And then if Moses was born in the very last year of Amram's life, then we could add the 80 years that Moses lived until the Exodus. That is a total of 350 years, and that is the absolute maximum time period that they could have been in Egypt in ancient times according to the scriptures, and that's not 430 years. In addition to that, Exodus 12 says the sojourning of the children of Israel was 430 years, and Genesis 35 tells us that Abraham and Isaac sojourned. That's a clear statement that the sojourning started with Abraham. So if we count the number of years from the time Abraham left his father's house for Canaan, right here, we would count 25 years plus 60 plus 130, and that equals a total of 215 years from the time Abraham left to Canaan until Jacob entered Egypt. Well, 215 years is exactly half of 430. So 430 years minus 215 equals 215. So we're told the 430 years ended on the same day Moses and the Israelites left Egypt. Therefore, the Israelites were in Egypt 215 years. The 430 years of sojourning and the 400 years of affliction are a subject of debate amongst Bible scholars. And I have links in the description below covering some of that controversy. But the scriptures seem to have shown definitively that the absolute maximum time period, the absolute maximum would still be less than 430 years. But specifically, it is 215 years because we are told that Abraham and Isaac sojourned as well. By the way, the 400 years of affliction, that may refer to something later in the future, but we'll talk about that in another video. For now, it's clear that the texts are telling us Abraham started the sojourning and it ended at the Exodus for a total of 430 years. So from the start of Abraham's sojourn until the entry into Egypt was 215 years, and the time period in Egypt was 215 years. So we know there were 71 years between the time Jacob entered Egypt and Joseph's death, and there were 80 years from Moses' birth until they left Egypt. So we subtract 71 from 215. And we subtract the 80 from 215, and that leaves us 64 years. So that means that there were 64 years from Joseph's death until Moses' birth. And that gives us a total of 215 years in Egypt, which we already knew because of the sojourning, the 430 years of sojourning. So the final part of the timeline from Abraham to David is simple. 1 Kings 6 verse 1 tells us that in the 480th year after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, Solomon was in his 4th year. So from the Exodus to Solomon's 4th year as king, there were 480 years. And then 1 Kings 1, 32 through 39 tells us David appointed Solomon as king at David's death. So Solomon became king after David. And 2 Samuel 5 verse 4 tells us David ruled as king for 40 years. So 40 years before Solomon became king, David started his rule. Okay, so now it seems that the number of years between Abraham's birth and the year David became king is absolutely clear by the scriptures. So let's just calculate this right here. There were 480 years after the Exodus to Solomon's 4th year. So we subtract 4 years back to the year of David's death. Then we subtract 40 years of David's reign to arrive at the number of years from the Exodus until David became king. Then we add the 430 years of sojourning. And then we add the 75 years from Abraham's birth until the start of the sojourning. And that gives us a total of 941 years from Abraham's birth to the year David became king. So Matthew 1 verse 17 tells us there were exactly 14 generations from Abraham to David. So if we divide 941 years by 14 generations, we get exactly 67.21 years in one generation. And this seems to be the maximum number of years that one generation represents in the book of Matthew, because as we discussed in a previous video, there were only 32 years in one generation between David and the carrying away into Babylon, and only 42 years in one generation between the carrying away to Jesus. There's one other possibility that maybe it refers to the time period from Abraham to David's death. However, that seems very unlikely, because if it was going to talk about David's death, it might as well just say, if it was going to say from Abraham to David's death, it might as well just say from Abraham to Solomon, because that was the same year Solomon started his reign. So really there were only two possibilities that seem likely, and that was either it's the generations from Abraham's birth to David's birth, or from Abraham's birth to the year David became king. Or it could be the year Abraham started his covenant to the year Abraham became king, to the year David became king. But that would be less as well. So here's the thing. Right now, 2015 is 67 years from the year that many scholars are saying the fig tree sprouted forth its leaves. So that means that the absolute maximum number of years that a generation can represent in the book of Matthew is 67 years and 79 days. 67.21 years. So in Matthew 24, where Jesus says all the things on his timeline will be completed within one generation after the fig tree puts forth leaves, he seems to have been saying everything on the timeline will occur within 67.21 years after the fig tree buds, because in the book of Matthew, one generation equals 67.21 years. That's the absolute maximum. Okay, so if Bible scholars are correct, and I don't know if they are, but it does seem like they are, if Bible scholars are correct that the spring of 1948 is the year the fig tree put forth leaves, then 2015 marks the end of the 67-year generation. It's not 70 years, you guys. I used to think that too, but I realize now it's not. Gabriel said everlasting righteousness will start after 70 years. The end of the generation is the asteroid impact. We talked about that before. More specifically, Jesus said the fig tree will bud in the springtime. So it's not the summer, it's not the fall, it's not the winter. Jesus said the fig tree will sprout forth leaves in the springtime. It's very important why he used that whole parable. Hosea tells us Israel is the first to ripen the fig tree. So if that was it, if the budding of the fig tree was the spring of 1948, when Israel was officially declared a nation, 67.21 years from that will be in the spring of 2015, right now, literally right now. Okay, but since spring ends in the northern hemisphere on June 20th, the maximum length of that generation would be 67.21 years from June 20th, 1948. Okay, so 0.21 of 1 year can be found by dividing the number 1. I mean, we take 1 year, right? 1 year. We want to find out how many days 0.21 represents, because it's 67 years, but it's a 0.21 of that year, that final year, right? So how many days is that? Well, we take 1 and we divide it by 4.6 and we get 0.21. So if we have 1 year, and we want to divide it into 0.21, we divide it by 4.6. So we're going to take 365 days in 1 year. We're going to divide that by 4.6, and that equals 79.34. That is equal to 0.21 right there. So the generation, one generation in the book of Matthew is equal to 67 years and 79 days. 67 years and 79 days from the final day of spring in 1948 lands on September 7th, 2015. We found out in previous videos that there are only 2 events left on Jesus' timeline, the asteroid impact and the rescue, and the scriptures tell us both of those events occur at the same time. Notice Jesus' timeline is not talking about Gabriel's timeline. Jesus said, everything on his timeline will be completed within 1 generation. That's not the same thing as the Revelation timeline. That's not the same thing as Gabriel's timeline. That's his timeline in Matthew 24. Okay? Everything on that event has happened except the asteroid impact and the rescue, and the texts tell us that asteroid impact and rescue occur at the same time, at the same exact time. In other words, there is only 1 event left on Jesus' timeline, and he indicated it will occur within 1 generation after the fig tree buds. So this is a very strong indication that the asteroid impact may occur before September 7th, 2015. In addition, and we've talked about this before, I'm not going to go into this too much, but I really, really beg you, if you have not watched the playlist, Bible's Countdown to the Asteroid Impact, I beg you to watch that, because everything on Gabriel's timeline has happened as well, except for the desolation in the midst of the week, which we know is the asteroid impact. We appear to be in Daniel's 1 week right now. We appear to be in Daniel's 7 years right now. That's not the tribulation. I know that's doctrine. That doctrine's not, I hate to say it's not correct, because who knows, maybe it will end up being correct. I don't know what's going to happen. All I can tell you is absolute 100% for sure that these events right here played out exactly according to Daniel 9. And Messiah appears to have been a code word, just like the word goat, just like the word lion with wings represented Nebuchadnezzar II. The goat represented Alexander the Great. Just like everything else in the book of Daniel, these words are codes, and the word Messiah appears to have been code. Okay, that's what the media was calling Obama. They were calling him Messiah. Also, the word Shabua, it has 3 different definitions. I'm begging you to please go watch that video, because these things on Gabriel's timeline really have happened, and it indicates that that budding of the fig tree really was the commandment by the UN to restore, to create the nation of Israel. I mean, these fulfillments are just truly unbelievable, and I really hope that if you haven't watched that playlist that you will. I'm not going to go into everything right now. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but the abomination of desolation, it already happened. It happened in 2012. It was the idol of terror placed in the hallowed place 1290 days after the oath was taken. It's an alternate translation of Daniel 9 that is totally valid. Please, I'm begging you, if you feel like you can't work through it yourself, go ask your pastor to prove it wrong. But, if you want to refer your pastor to something, refer them to that playlist, Bible's Countdown to the Asteroid Impact, because that's where I've tried to piece it together as clearly as possible. I mean, these things really did happen. The sign of Revelation 12, the idol of terror, the abomination of desolation, it happened in August of 2012. The 1335th day was a month later in September of 2012. The sign of Revelation 12 occurred a month after that in October of 2012. I'm not making this up. I'm really not making this up. I know it sounds unbelievable, but it's totally real. This is how things are playing out. It's just mind-boggling. But here's the thing. We're not given the time period in the text. Do not give us the exact time period between that sign and the escape. We're not given the exact time period between the abomination of desolation and the escape. I know a lot of people think it's the same day, but that's not what the texts say. The Bible does not tell us how much time specifically there is between the abomination of desolation and the escape. It does not tell us that. I know it's doctrine. I know what the doctrine is. But it doesn't say that. I mean, in the book, Jesus referred us to the book of Daniel about the abomination of desolation. It very clearly tells us there's 1290 days before it. Very clearly tells us it's associated with the 1335 days. Very clearly, once we examine this material, we can see that the sign of Revelation 12 also has to occur along with the abomination of desolation. Those things are very clear, and those things happened, but it does not tell us how much time between the abomination of desolation and the escape. It doesn't tell us how much time between the sign of Revelation 12 and the escape, and those things happen together. The sign and the abomination of desolation, that's what happened in 2012. But we do know that 3 days is very significant, and days can also be years. So 3 years from the abomination of desolation in 2012 and the sign of Revelation 12 that happened in 2012. 3 years from that. 3 years from that first fulfillment in 2012, August 2nd, 2012. 3 years from that will be August 2nd, 2015. And notice that the whole month of August in 2015 is highlighted by that 67.21 years from the budding of the fig tree in 1948. So the official declaration of the country of Israel occurred on May 14th, 1948. 67 years and 79 days after that lands on August 1st, 2015. Gabriel indicated we should count the Shavuots from the going forth of the commandment to restore Jerusalem. And the first Shavuot in 1948 was on June 13th. 67 years and 79 days after that lands on August 31st. So those two major dates in 1948, when we add the one generation, the exact number of years in one generation, we add that to those major dates in 1948, we end up with it lands on exactly August 1st and August 31st. Can you believe that? It highlights exactly the month of August. And Jesus said we won't know the day or the hour. I mean, why did he say that? Why didn't he just say we won't know the time? He didn't. He said we won't know the day or the hour. Does that mean we might be able to determine when the month is? I don't know. But this is blowing my mind. The other thing is the month of August is also significant for the dragon countries in Asia because it marks the exact 70 years from the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's in August. And August is also the true 10th month in the 7th year on the ancient biblical calendar in the southern hemisphere from July 16th until August 13th. So we know in the story of Esther, the bride is crowned. The bride is actually taken to the king's house in the 10th month of the 7th year. And we are in the 7th year of the king right now, Obama. Well, I mean, it's figurative speaking. Obviously, we don't think of him as a king, but it's the same principle. It's the leader of the country. The 7th year, his 7th year. We are in that 7th year right now. That's what that story says, and it's alluding to the escape, the rescue. I mean, I've never seen anything this convincing ever. In my 4 years that I've been on YouTube, none of my watch dates have ever been this important. I've never. And you guys have been with me. You see how stuff is happening on our watch dates. Every year. It's so weird. Okay, so finally, Jesus said, I mean, you already know this. Jesus said the stars will fall and the rescue will occur immediately after the tribulation of the days, right? Daniel 12 and Revelation 12 are clear that the tribulation of the days refers to exactly 1260 days. And the Bible makes clear that days can also represent years. So the 1260 years are believed by many Bible scholars to end in either 2015 or 2016, namely Adam Clark. But that places the start of the 1260 years in 755 or 756, which was exactly 70 years after the abomination of desolation was set up in 685. And the sign of Revelation 12 that happened in 2012, the same exact sign, it's a celestial configuration. The same one occurred in 686 when that abomination of desolation occurred in 685. And that they were building the Dome of the Rock from 685 to 691. The sign of Revelation 12 occurred in 686, the same exact sign that occurred in 2012. And that event, the abomination of desolation in 685, is according to Daniel 11. I did the Daniel 11 chart. That abomination of desolation, and I mean that is specific. It lands exactly on the abomination of desolation in 685. Okay, 1290 years after the temple rituals were interrupted in 606 BC. But exactly 70 years after that abomination of desolation in 685 and the sign in the sky in 686, exactly 70 years after that was 755 and 756, which Adam Clark is saying is the start date of the 1260 years. Adam Clark, by the way, he wrote that book in what was it, 1825 or something. So I don't think he knew, I don't know if he knew about the 70 years or not, but it was exactly 70 years after that abomination of desolation. See, the standard doctrine does not, as far as I know, they don't believe that 685 Dome of the Rock is the abomination of desolation. I've never seen the Daniel 11 timeline like it is. I wouldn't have bothered creating that timeline if I thought somebody else had done it. I've never seen it before. I've never seen any of this before. It shocks me that nobody's paying attention because this is truly amazing. 70 years after that Dome of the Rock lands in 755, and 1260 years after that lands in 2015. Both Jesus and Jeremiah say the event, the asteroid impact, will occur at the end of both a 1260 day or year period and a 70-year period. You can see it's right there. 1260 years and 70 years ending in 2015. And And the 2015 marks the end of the 70 years from 1945, which was the year the rise of the eighth king happened. That was the king of fierce countenance in Daniel that destroys by peace the United Nations. And that eighth king is the riddle in Revelation 7. And notice the eighth secretary general is currently presiding over the United Nations. In other words, the eighth king of the eighth king is currently presiding in 2015. I feel like I'm dreaming this. And the Vatican is also in their eighth king since the popes were made kings in 1929. So as I said before, this is the most important watch date I've ever looked at, that we've ever looked at on this channel. Before September, it's before. The generation ends September 7th. That means Jesus said this last event, the rescue, and the start of the tribulation, the 3.5-year tribulation, he said that is the only thing that hasn't happened yet on Jesus' timeline. He said it will happen before the end of that generation. That generation's ending on September 7th this year. I can't believe it. I just can't believe it. I can't believe no one else has discovered this. I can't believe I'm discovering it this year, like 3 months before it ends. I don't know why I didn't figure it out before. I don't know why no one else figured it out before. It's so weird to me. This is unbelievably amazing. I just am blown away. And it just seems like no one cares, which is exactly what the texts say. So there's nothing I can do about it. So I beg you to watch the playlist Bible's Countdown to the Asteroid. There's more information linked below this video. And you can also find transcripts of some of these videos at indigoflower.net. And if you liked this video, please consider providing support, because I can't do this without your help. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's making this research possible. I hope you're all doing well, and I will talk to you next week. Okay, bye-bye.